There's a version of this story you've probably already heard, whispered through mutual friends, glimpsed through social media you probably shouldn't still be checking, hinted at in the strange secondhand reports that somehow keep finding their way back to you, no matter how hard you've tried to build distance. He's not doing well. Someone said he's barely recognizable lately. Apparently, he's been unraveling since you left. And if you're the one who left, the one who finally, after everything, walked away, some part of you is probably sitting with this information uncomfortably, unsure what to actually do with it, because you spent years being told, directly or indirectly, that you were the difficult one, the unstable one, the one whose emotions were somehow too much to manage. And now here he is, genuinely falling apart in ways that seem to confirm something you were never allowed to say out loud while you were still there, absorbing the consequences of his behavior on his behalf. Today, we're going to talk about what's actually happening inside a narcissist when he genuinely breaks down after you've left. Not the performed crisis, not the manipulative tears calculated to draw you back, but the real thing, the genuine unraveling that sometimes does occur once enough time has passed for the full weight of permanent loss to finally, undeniably register. And understanding the real reason behind this breakdown is going to matter enormously for how you interpret it, because the reason is almost never what either of you initially assumes it to be. Let's start by dismantling the assumption that probably feels most natural, the one that would be the simplest, most emotionally satisfying explanation available, that he's breaking down because he finally understands how much he loved you, how much he took you for granted, how devastating the loss of someone as genuinely valuable as you actually is now that you're gone. This explanation is appealing, understandably so, because it offers something you were likely denied throughout the entire relationship: validation that you mattered, that the connection was real, that his behavior wasn't simply careless disregard for someone replaceable and insignificant. But here's the uncomfortable truth this explanation obscures, one we've touched on throughout previous conversations, but that deserves direct, focused attention today. His breakdown, when it's genuine, is rarely actually about you specifically in the way this explanation would require it to be. Remember what we've discussed extensively about narcissistic psychology. His sense of self depends heavily on external structures: validation, admiration, a stable sense of significance secured through his effect on the people around him. You functioned, for however long the relationship lasted, as one of the most significant sources of this external structure, absorbing his moods, managing his emotional regulation, providing the audience his fragile sense of self required in order to feel stable and secure. When you leave, genuinely and permanently, you don't just remove a person he loved. You remove an entire load-bearing structure his psychological stability had been quietly, unconsciously depending on, often for years, sometimes without either of you ever fully recognizing how much weight that structure was actually carrying. This is the real reason behind genuine narcissistic breakdown following permanent loss, and it's considerably less romantic, considerably less validating in the way you might initially hope than the explanation involving genuine love finally being recognized too late. Here's what actually collapses when this structure is removed, and understanding each piece reveals why the breakdown, when genuine, tends to be so much more severe and so much more prolonged than ordinary grief over a relationship's ending. The first thing that collapses is what we might call his regulatory outsourcing. Throughout the relationship, whether either of you consciously recognized this dynamic, you likely functioned as a significant source of emotional regulation for him, absorbing his anxiety, managing his insecurity, providing reassurance that helped stabilize whatever internal instability existed beneath his outward confidence. This wasn't a fair arrangement, and it certainly wasn't your responsibility to provide. but it was functioning nonetheless, whether either of you named it directly or not. When you leave, this regulatory function doesn't simply pause, waiting for a replacement to eventually step in and resume providing it. It disappears entirely, at least temporarily, leaving him without the external stabilization. His own internal architecture was never actually built to provide independently. This is precisely why genuine breakdown following permanent loss often looks less like ordinary grief and more like a kind of systemic destabilization. Sleep disruption, difficulty concentrating, uncharacteristic emotional volatility, sometimes even physical symptoms that seem to have no clear medical explanation. Because what's actually happening isn't simply sadness. It's the direct physiological consequence of losing access to co-regulation his own nervous system had become significantly dependent on, without ever developing the independent capacity to provide this stabilization for himself. The second thing that collapses is his narrative infrastructure. Throughout the relationship, he likely maintained a specific self-serving story about who he is, one that required your continued participation, whether through active agreement or simply through your presence as an audience willing to witness and implicitly validate this narrative. Your departure doesn't just remove you as a person, it removes the specific audience this narrative depended on, forcing him to either maintain the story entirely through internal repetition without any external reinforcement, or confront the increasingly obvious gap between the story and the reality your absence makes undeniable. This narrative collapse produces its own kind of psychological crisis, one distinct from, but often occurring simultaneously, with the regulatory collapse we just discussed. Without you present to reflect back whatever version of himself he needed reflected, he's left facing something his psychological structure has almost no practiced capacity to handle: an unmediated confrontation with whatever reality exists underneath the narrative, unfiltered by the external validation that used to make that confrontation avoidable. The third thing that collapses, and this one deserves particularly careful examination because it explains something that often confuses people trying to understand a narcissist's genuine breakdown, is what we might call his predictive competence. Throughout his entire adult life, likely stretching back into adolescence or even earlier, he's operated according to a fairly reliable model of how his tactics function, how people respond to his charm, his manipulation, his carefully calibrated performances designed to secure whatever outcome he needs from any given interaction. This model has probably worked with reasonable consistency across most of his significant relationships, which means his sense of competence, his sense of understanding how the world and the people in it actually function, has been built almost entirely on this model's continued reliability. Your sustained absence, particularly if you've maintained genuine no contact rather than the more familiar pattern of eventual return that his model likely predicted, represents a catastrophic failure of this predictive system. And this failure doesn't stay neatly contained to just this one relationship. It threatens something considerably larger: his fundamental confidence in his own understanding of how to navigate the world successfully. If the tactics that always worked before genuinely, permanently failed this time, what does that suggest about his ability to secure what he needs in every future relationship, every future interaction, every future situation where he's relied on this same basic model to produce the outcomes he requires? This is precisely why genuine breakdown following permanent loss often extends well beyond grief specifically related to you, bleeding into broader anxiety, broader instability, broader crisis that seems disproportionate to losing just one relationship, however significant that relationship was. What's actually happening isn't simply mourning your absence specifically. It's confronting the genuine possibility that his entire operational understanding of how to successfully navigate relationships and secure what he needs from other people might be fundamentally, catastrophically flawed, a possibility his psychological structure has spent an entire lifetime successfully avoiding, until your genuine departure finally made continued avoidance impossible. Here's what's crucial to understand about all three of these collapsing structures together, because it directly addresses the question probably sitting underneath everything we've discussed today. Does this genuine breakdown mean anything about whether he actually loved you? Whether the connection was genuinely as significant to him as you always hoped it was? The honest answer, one that requires releasing a hope this question naturally creates, is more complicated than either a simple yes or no could fully capture. Something about his relationship with you was genuinely significant, genuinely irreplaceable in specific ways, which is precisely why its removal produces such significant psychological consequence. But this significance was never actually about you specifically, in the sense of your unique individual qualities, your particular personality, the specific things that made you genuinely, irreplaceably you. It was about the specific functions you provided, functions that theoretically could have been provided by someone else entirely. Had circumstances arranged themselves differently, had he met someone else willing and able to provide the same regulatory stabilization, the same narrative audience, the same predictable responsiveness his psychological structure had come to depend on? This distinction matters enormously, and it's worth sitting with directly rather than rushing past in favor of a more comfortable interpretation. His breakdown reveals genuine dependence, genuine significance in terms of the structural role you occupied in his psychological stability. It doesn't necessarily reveal genuine love in the sense you likely mean when you ask this question, the kind of love that would have produced consistent care, consistent respect, consistent prioritization of your well-being throughout the relationship itself, rather than only becoming visible once your absence forced a confrontation he could no longer avoid. This is precisely why understanding his genuine breakdown correctly matters so much for your own healing, because misinterpreting it, reading it as proof of a love that would have looked completely different if it had actually been present throughout the relationship, risks pulling you back toward exactly the kind of hope that kept you trapped in this dynamic for as long as you were. His genuine suffering doesn't retroactively transform the relationship into something it never actually was while you were still present within it. It simply reveals what his absence has forced into visibility: genuine structural dependence, finally confronting reality without you there to buffer it, exactly as everything we've discussed throughout previous conversations about narcissistic psychology would predict. Here's what actually matters more than understanding the precise mechanism behind his breakdown, though understanding it accurately does matter for protecting yourself from misinterpretation. What you do with this information now that you have it. Because here's the trap waiting for anyone who learns their narcissistic ex is genuinely struggling, genuinely breaking down, genuinely confronting exactly the kind of psychological crisis we've spent this entire conversation examining. It's easy, especially if some part of you still carries genuine compassion despite everything you experienced, to feel pulled toward reaching out, toward offering exactly the kind of stabilization his breakdown suggests he desperately needs. Resist this pull and understand clearly why resisting it matters, both for you and, in a strange, counterintuitive way, for him as well. Because here's what genuine intervention on your part would actually accomplish if you allowed his breakdown to draw you back into providing the regulatory function your absence finally, painfully removed. It would simply restore the exact structural dependence that prevented him from ever developing genuine internal capacity for self-regulation genuine internal stability that doesn't require external outsourcing to someone else's emotional labor in order to function. Your return wouldn't heal him. It would simply pause his crisis, deferring it once again to whatever future moment your presence eventually becomes unavailable again, whether through another departure or simply through the natural limitations of what you're able to sustainably provide indefinitely. His breakdown, however genuine, however difficult it might be to witness even from a distance, represents something his own psychological system genuinely needs to move through, one way or another, in order to develop whatever internal capacity he might eventually build for himself, assuming he's actually capable of building it at all. Your intervention, however compassionate its intention, would only interrupt this process rather than genuinely helping it resolve into anything resembling real growth. This is ultimately the real reason the narcissist you left is breaking down, and it's worth carrying this understanding forward, not as validation that finally proves you mattered in the way you always hoped, but as accurate, clarifying information about exactly what role you occupied and exactly why stepping fully, permanently out of that role was never actually cruelty on your part. It was simply, finally, the truth catching up to a structure that was never built to last without you propping it up. Here's what matters now. More than anything we've discussed about what's actually happening inside him, what you do with this understanding on your own side of this permanent separation. Because there's a specific trap hiding inside all of this knowledge, one that's easy to fall into, precisely because understanding his breakdown so thoroughly can start to feel like a kind of ongoing project, something worth continuing to track, continuing to interpret, continuing to hold space for in your own mind long after it should have any claim on your daily attention at all. Knowing exactly why he's unraveling, understanding the regulatory collapse, the narrative collapse, the predictive collapse in clinical detail can quietly become another way of staying tethered to him, just dressed up in the language of psychological insight instead of the language of longing. This is worth naming directly, because it's subtle enough to slip past without your noticing. Checking in on how he's doing, even out of what feels like simple curiosity or clinical interest, still keeps a channel open. Interpreting every piece of secondhand information that reaches you, turning it over, fitting it into the framework we've built throughout this conversation, still spends emotional energy on him rather than on the life you're supposed to be building without him in it. Real freedom here doesn't come from becoming an expert in his unraveling. It comes from reaching a point where the information simply stops registering as urgent, stops requiring your analysis, stops mattering enough to interrupt whatever you were actually doing with your day when it happened to reach you. This is a different kind of peace than understanding provides, and it's the one that actually matters most. Here's something else worth sitting with honestly. Even in the rare cases where a narcissist's breakdown does eventually produce something resembling genuine reflection, genuine movement toward real accountability, rather than simply psychological crisis followed by supply diversification, this growth almost never happens on a timeline that would make reconciliation wise, even if it happened to align with a moment when you might still be open to it. Real change, if it comes at all, typically requires years of sustained, unglamorous work, therapy, honest self-confrontation, tolerance for exactly the kind of internal discomfort his psychological structure spent a lifetime avoiding. It doesn't arrive as a single dramatic breakdown followed by a clean, permanent transformation. It arrives slowly, inconsistently, if it arrives at all, and it belongs entirely to a process you were never meant to supervise or wait around to witness. So here is what this understanding is actually for. Not to make you feel triumphant about his suffering, not to make you feel guilty for having left, not to give you a reason to keep half a foot in a door that's already correctly closed. It's to release you completely from needing his breakdown to mean anything at all about your own worth, your own decision, or your own future. You already know what you survived. You don't need his unraveling to confirm it, and you don't need his stability to feel guilty about it either. Whatever happens inside him now, whether he rebuilds, whether he repeats the same pattern with someone else, whether he never fully recovers the sense of competence your departure took from him, none of it requires your witness, your analysis, or your care in order to unfold. You get to simply, finally, stop watching. Not because you stopped caring what happens to another human being in some abstract sense, but because you finally, completely placed your own life at the center of your own attention, where it always should have been.